Go kiss him, my friend whispered, sliding a shot glass across the sticky wooden bar toward me. I dare you. I should have said no. Any reasonable person would have. The man she pointed at sat alone at the far end of the bar, a place most people seemed to avoid without even realizing it. The music was loud, the kind of bass that vibrated through the floorboards of the crowded downtown Chicago bar, and laughter spilled from every corner of the room. Neon lights reflected off rows of liquor bottles like tiny constellations, and the air smelled faintly of citrus, whiskey, and rain drifting in every time the door opened. But somehow, around that man, the atmosphere felt different. Still, quiet in a way that didn't belong in a place like this. I followed her gaze and spotted him immediately. Not because he was doing anything dramatic. Quite the opposite. He sat perfectly still on a tall bar stool, a glass of amber whiskey resting in his hand. His black suit jacket was folded neatly over the back of his chair, sleeves of his crisp white shirt rolled just enough to show the edge of a watch that probably cost more than my car. He wasn't talking to anyone. Wasn't scrolling on his phone. Just watching the room with calm, unreadable eyes. The kind of eyes that made people look away first. No way, I said, laughing nervously. You're insane. Chicken, my friend shot back, grinning. It's just a kiss. 2 seconds. Then you come right back. I looked again toward the man. Something about him made my stomach tighten. Maybe it was the way the bartender kept glancing his direction, like he was making sure the man's drink was never empty. Or maybe it was how the crowded bar somehow left 3 empty seats around him, as if people instinctively gave him space without knowing why. But the tequila buzz humming through my head made everything feel lighter, less serious. It was a dare. Just a stupid bar dare people would laugh about for 10 minutes, and forget by morning. I picked up the shot glass and downed it before I could think too hard about it. The burn ran down my throat, warm and reckless. Fine, I said, sliding off my stool. Watch this. My friends erupted in quiet giggles behind me as I walked across the bar. The wooden floor creaked under my sneakers. The music thumped. Conversations blurred together around me. And yet the closer I got to him, the quieter everything seemed to feel. Up close, he looked even more intimidating. Early 30s maybe. Dark hair neatly styled, strong jawline, calm expression that didn't shift as I approached. His attention moved from the glass in his hand to me, slowly, like he had already noticed me coming before I even stood in front of him. For half a second, doubt flickered through my mind. This was a terrible idea, but it was too late to turn back now. I leaned forward before I could lose my nerve, placing one quick, impulsive kiss against his cheek. The contact lasted maybe 1 second. 2 at most. Then I pulled back, ready to laugh it off, ready to say it was a dare. But the moment I looked around the bar, something felt wrong. The music was still playing. People were still talking. But every person within 10 feet of us had gone completely silent. The bartender froze mid-pour. A man standing nearby slowly lowered his drink. And the look they were all giving me wasn't amusement. It was shock. The kind of silence that spreads when someone has just done something they absolutely should not have done. I turned back toward the man slowly. He was already looking at me. Calm. Expression unreadable. And for the first time that night, I had the strange feeling that I had just stepped into a story I didn't understand yet. For a moment, neither of us moved. The bass from the speakers continued to pulse through the bar. Glasses clinked somewhere behind me, and a group near the pool table laughed a little too loudly, but the small circle of space around us felt strangely frozen. The man studied me with a calm that made my confidence evaporate almost instantly. Up close, his eyes were darker than I had expected, steady and focused, like he was examining a puzzle rather than a person who had just kissed him without warning. My brain scrambled to recover. I forced a small laugh and lifted both hands in surrender. That was a dare, I said quickly, nodding toward my friends across the bar. They were watching with wide eyes, suddenly very interested in their drinks. Just a stupid game. I am really sorry. If that was weird. The man did not answer immediately. Instead, he set his whiskey glass down on the bar with careful precision. The ice shifted softly inside the glass, the quiet sound somehow louder than the music. His gaze flicked briefly toward the group of friends behind me, then returned to my face. A dare, he repeated slowly, his voice calm and deep. There was no anger in it. No amusement either. Just quiet observation. I nodded, suddenly aware of how ridiculous the situation looked. Yes, my friends thought it would be funny. The corner of his mouth moved almost imperceptibly, not quite a smile, but close enough to make my pulse skip. Did they? He asked. Before I could respond, the bartender hurried over, wiping his hands on a white towel with unusual urgency. Another whiskey, sir? He asked the man, his tone unusually respectful. The man gave a small nod without looking away from me. Thank you, Daniel. The bartender poured the drink immediately, hands moving faster than they had all night. When he slid the glass forward, he gave me a quick glance that carried a silent message I could not quite decipher. It looked almost like concern. I shifted my weight, suddenly aware that I had stepped into something much bigger than a harmless joke. Well, I said awkwardly, stepping back half a pace. I should probably get back to my friends now. I turned slightly, ready to escape the strange tension hanging in the air. Sophie. The sound of my name stopped me instantly. My head turned back toward him in surprise. I was certain I had never introduced myself. He leaned one elbow lightly on the bar, completely relaxed, as if nothing unusual had happened at all. Sophie Bennett, he said again, the words smooth and certain. A chill ran up my spine. How do you know my name? I asked. For the first time his expression shifted just enough to reveal a faint hint of amusement. You walked in 20 minutes ago, he said simply. You ordered a margarita and complained about the parking meter outside. My mind raced backward through the night. I had said that to the bartender when I first arrived. Loud enough for people nearby to hear. But still, the fact that he had noticed felt strangely unsettling. Right, I said slowly. That makes sense. The bartender cleared, his throat quietly behind the counter, glancing between us like someone watching a storm approach. Around us the bar slowly returned to normal. Conversations resumed. Music filled the air again, but a few curious eyes still drifted our way every few seconds. The man lifted his glass again, the amber liquid catching the neon light above the bar. So, he said calmly, your friends dared you to kiss the most serious man in the room. My face warmed slightly. Something like that. He took a small sip of his drink, still watching me with that same thoughtful expression. And did you win the dare? He asked. I hesitated, suddenly unsure of the rules of a game I had started without thinking. I guess I did, I said carefully. For a brief moment he said nothing. Then he set the glass down again and spoke in the same calm voice. You should probably go back to your friends now, Sophie. Relief flooded through me instantly. Yes, I said, letting out a nervous laugh. That is probably a good idea. I turned again toward the crowded bar, ready to retreat to the safety of my friends and pretend the whole moment had been nothing more than a reckless joke. But as I took the first step away, I heard the bartender whisper to someone beside him in a tone that was barely audible over the music. She has no idea who that is. And the quiet answer came back, just as softly. No, she definitely does not. I had almost reached my friends when I felt it again. That strange shift in the room. It was subtle, the kind of thing you might miss if you were not paying attention. The music still played, glasses still clinked, and people still laughed around the crowded bar, but the energy had changed. My friends were staring at me like I had just walked away from a ticking bomb. I slid back onto the stool beside them, trying to act casual even though my heart was beating faster than it should have. Well, my friend Jenna whispered immediately. Did you actually do it? I grabbed my drink and took a long sip before answering. Yes, I said, and it was the most awkward 2 seconds of my life. The group erupted into nervous laughter, but it was the kind that ended too quickly. Everyone kept glancing past me toward the other end of the bar. I followed their eyes. The man was still sitting there exactly where I had left him, his posture relaxed, his attention calmly moving around the room like he was reading a story that only he could see. Why is everyone acting so weird? I asked quietly. My friend Tyler leaned closer across the table, lowering his voice. Sophie, he said carefully. Do you know who that guy is? I shrugged. Some rich guy who likes whiskey and sitting alone? No one laughed this time. Jenna shook her head slowly. No, that is Adrian Moretti. The name meant absolutely nothing to me. I frowned. Should that mean something? Tyler ran a hand through his hair like he was trying to figure out how to explain something complicated to someone who had just walked into the middle of it. Let us just say, he said slowly, that people in this city do not usually walk up and kiss Adrian Moretti without asking first. I blinked. Why? Jenna leaned closer, her voice barely louder than the music. Because he owns this place. I looked around the bar instinctively. It was a busy downtown spot, The kind of place packed with young professionals on a Friday night. Nothing about it suggested mystery or danger. Just music, laughter, and too many people squeezed around small tables. Okay, I said slowly. So he owns the bar. That explains why the bartender was so polite. Tyler shook his head again. No, that explains maybe 10% of it. A slow knot of confusion began tightening in my chest. Then what explains the other 90%? For a moment no one answered. The group exchanged the same uneasy look people share when they are deciding whether or not to say something out loud. Finally Jenna sighed and leaned closer across the table. Adrian Moretti does not just own bars, she said quietly. He owns half the nightlife in this part of the city. I let out a small laugh, assuming she was exaggerating. That sounds like a successful business plan. Tyler gave a small shake of his head. You are not understanding. I followed his gaze again toward the other end of the room. Adrian Moretti had not moved much since I left him. He was still sitting calmly, one hand resting near his glass, speaking quietly to the bartender for a moment before the man hurried away again. But now that I looked more carefully, I noticed something else. The people standing nearby gave his table space without even thinking about it. No one bumped into him. No one accidentally leaned against the bar beside him. It was like the air around him had invisible boundaries. Sophie, Jenna said softly. People in Chicago know his name for a reason. I turned back toward my friends, my confusion growing stronger by the second. Then maybe someone should explain it to me, I said. Tyler opened his mouth to answer, but before he could say a word the bartender suddenly appeared beside our table again. He was holding a fresh drink on a small napkin. He placed it carefully in front of me. From the gentleman at the bar, he said politely. I looked down at the glass, then slowly lifted my eyes toward the other end of the room. Adrian Moretti was watching me again. Calm, patient, and somehow completely certain that I would look back. The glass sat in front of me like a question I was not sure how to answer. The lime wedge rested neatly on the rim and condensation slowly rolled down the side, leaving small trails across the napkin beneath it. None of my friends touched their drinks. They were all staring at me again. I looked back across the bar. Adrian Moretti had not moved from his seat, but the moment our eyes met he lifted his glass slightly in a quiet gesture, almost like a polite greeting. Not a smile, just calm acknowledgement. I turned back toward the bartender. He sent this? I asked. The bartender nodded quickly. Yes, ma'am. His voice carried the careful tone of someone who did not want to say too much. He asked me to make sure you received it. I hesitated for a moment, then glanced again toward the far end of the bar. Adrian was already looking away now, speaking quietly with another employee who had approached him. The interaction lasted only a few seconds before the employee nodded respectfully and walked off again. Everything about the exchange felt organized, like the room moved slightly differently around him. You should probably say thank you, Jenna whispered beside me. Why? I asked quietly. Because people do not usually ignore Adrian Moretti when he sends them something, Tyler answered under his breath. I looked down at the drink again. The whole situation felt surreal. 20 minutes ago, I had walked into this bar thinking about parking meters and whether the place served decent margaritas. Now my friends were acting like I had accidentally stepped into a completely different world. Fine, I muttered, sliding off the stool again. I will go say thank you, and then we can stop acting like this is some kind of international incident. Tyler grabbed my wrist lightly. Sophie, I paused and looked at him. Just be normal, he said carefully. I raised an eyebrow. I am always normal. Jenna gave a quiet laugh that sounded more nervous than amused. That is exactly the problem tonight. I picked up the glass and walked back across the bar, weaving through clusters of people talking and laughing under the neon lights. The music shifted to a slower rhythm, the bass humming softly through the wooden floorboards. Adrian noticed me approaching again before I even reached the counter. His attention moved toward me with the same calm awareness as before, like he had been expecting me to come back. I placed the drink on the bar beside him and folded my arms lightly. Your bartender says this is from you, I said. It is, he replied. His voice was steady, almost thoughtful. I thought it might make up for the awkward moment earlier. I gave a small smile. You mean the moment where I kissed a stranger because my friends dared me to? The faintest hint of amusement touched his expression again. Yes, he said simply. That moment. I picked up the glass and took a small sip. The drink was better than the first one I had ordered. Well, I said, setting it down again. Thank you. For a few seconds neither of us spoke. The music filled the space between us while people moved around the crowded room. Then Adrian leaned slightly against the bar, his attention returning fully to me. "Tell me something, Sophie," he said calmly. "Do your dares usually end with you having a second conversation with the person involved?" I shrugged lightly. "Usually they end with my friends laughing at me, and then we all forget about it." He studied me for a moment, as if measuring that answer. "And tonight?" he asked quietly. I met his eyes, suddenly, aware again of the strange gravity around him. "Tonight," I said, "I am starting to think my friends know something about you that I do not." Adrian did not answer right away. Instead, he lifted his glass, the ice shifting softly again. Then he said something that made my curiosity grow even stronger. "Your friends are probably being cautious," he said. "People in this city tend to be." For a few seconds I just stared at him, trying to decide if that answer was mysterious on purpose or if he simply enjoyed speaking in calm riddles. Around us the bar continued to buzz with energy. A group near the jukebox cheered as a familiar song started playing. Someone dropped a handful of quarters on the counter, and the scent of grilled burgers drifted out from the kitchen behind the swinging doors. Everything looked normal. Everything sounded normal. And yet standing next to Adrian Moretti still felt like being slightly outside the rhythm of the room. "Cautious about what exactly?" I asked. Adrian tilted his head slightly, studying me the same way he had been doing all night, as if every word I said was something worth examining. "About who they speak to," he replied. "About who they approach. About who they kiss without warning." I could not help laughing softly at that. "Okay, when you say it like that it sounds much worse than it actually was." His expression softened just enough to show that he understood the humor, even if he did not laugh out loud. "Perhaps," he said, "but actions have a way of carrying meaning whether we intend them to or not." I leaned against the bar beside him, swirling the drink slowly in my hand. The ice clinked against the glass, a small steady rhythm under the music. "You keep saying things like that," I said, "like my friends should be nervous about something." Adrian lifted one eyebrow slightly. "And yet you are not." "Should I be?" I asked. He held my gaze for a moment before answering. "That depends on how comfortable you are with unexpected attention." The words made me glance briefly across the room again. My friends were still sitting at the table, pretending to talk among themselves, but clearly watching every second of this conversation. Tyler noticed me looking and immediately looked away like someone who had been caught staring at the sun. I turned back to Adrian. "You know," I said thoughtfully, "for someone who owns half the nightlife in this city, you seem surprisingly calm about random strangers kissing you in public." This time he actually smiled, though it was subtle and brief. "You would be surprised how rarely that happens." "Then I should probably apologize again," I said. It was not exactly a well-planned introduction. "On the contrary," Adrian replied. "It was memorable. Something about the way he said that made the moment feel heavier than the casual conversation it appeared to be." I took another sip of the drink to give myself a second to think. The flavor was smooth and bright. The bartender clearly knew what he was doing. "So tell me something," I said after a moment. "Why were you sitting over here alone in a place you own while everyone else is having fun?" Adrian glanced around the crowded room slowly, his eyes passing over the dance floor, the tables, the bright lights reflecting off the polished wood bar. "Observing," he said simply. "You observe people for entertainment?" I asked. "Sometimes," he answered. "Sometimes it is simply useful to see how people behave when they believe no one important is watching." I frowned slightly. "And tonight?" His attention returned to me, steady and thoughtful again. "Tonight," he said, "someone walked into my bar, ignored every unspoken rule in the room, and kissed me without asking." He paused briefly, then added quietly, "That tends to stand out." I laughed again, though my curiosity was growing stronger by the minute. "You make it sound like I broke some kind of secret law." Adrian did not answer right away. Instead, he finished the last sip of his whiskey and set the empty glass down on the counter. The ice melted slowly inside it, ticking softly as it settled. Then he looked at me with that same calm expression and said something that made the night feel suddenly much more complicated. "You did not break a rule," he said. "You simply ignored one that everyone else already understands." I frowned slightly at his words, letting them settle in my mind while the music from the speakers shifted into another song. The rhythm was slower now, deeper, vibrating through the wooden floor beneath my feet. "A rule everyone else understands," I repeated. You make this place sound like it. Comes with a handbook. Adrian rested his forearms lightly on the bar, his posture relaxed in a way that looked completely natural, yet somehow controlled at the same time. Not a handbook, he said. More like instinct. I tilted my head. Instinct about what? His gaze moved briefly across the room again. Two men in suits had just entered through the front door, pausing for a moment as they scanned the bar before quietly taking seats near the far wall. I noticed something strange then. The moment they stepped inside, their attention flicked toward Adrian. Not in a casual way. More like a silent check to confirm he was there. Adrian acknowledged them with the smallest nod before looking back at me. Instinct about where power sits in a room, he said calmly. I followed his earlier glance, trying to understand what he meant. From the outside, the bar looked like any other busy downtown spot. People laughing. A couple dancing near the jukebox. Someone arguing about a baseball score near the pool table. Nothing about the scene suggested anything unusual. And yet, now that he had said it, I could not ignore what I was noticing. The bartender kept glancing toward Adrian every few minutes. The security guard near the entrance stood a little straighter whenever Adrian looked his direction. Even the servers weaving between tables seemed careful not to interrupt his space. You are saying everyone here knows who you are? I said slowly. Adrian gave a small shrug. Most people. Except me. That earned another faint smile. Except you. I leaned back against the bar again, folding my arms as I studied him more carefully this time. You know, I said, if my friends had told me all of this before the dare, I probably would have picked a different person. I suspected as much, Adrian replied. I laughed softly. That is reassuring at least. For a moment we simply stood there while the noise of the bar swirled around us. Someone shouted happily when their team scored on the television mounted above the counter. Glasses clinked again. A server rushed past carrying a tray of fries and burgers that smelled incredible. The ordinary chaos of a Friday night continued without interruption. But the more time I spent standing next to Adrian Moretti, the more it felt like I had stepped slightly outside of it. So tell me something honestly, I said after a moment. When I walked up earlier and kissed you, what did you think? Adrian did not answer right away. He picked up the empty glass in front of him and slowly turned it between his fingers, watching the last pieces of melting ice slide across the bottom. At first, he said, I thought you were very brave. Brave, I repeated. Most people would say reckless. Sometimes those are the same thing, he said quietly. I considered that for a moment. And now? I asked. His eyes met mine again, steady and thoughtful in the low bar light. For the first time all evening, his voice carried the faintest hint of curiosity. Now, he said, I am wondering whether you realized you just made yourself the most interesting person in this room. I blinked, unsure whether that was a compliment or a warning. Because of a dare? I asked. Adrian shook his head slowly. Because of what people will assume about you now. The words hung in the air between us, heavy with meaning I still did not fully understand. I followed his gaze across the bar again. A few people were looking in our direction, not openly staring, but definitely noticing. And suddenly the quiet comment from the bartender earlier replayed in my mind. She has no idea who that is. I looked back at Adrian, the knot of curiosity tightening again in my chest. What exactly are they assuming? I asked. Adrian did not answer immediately. Instead, he leaned slightly closer, his voice calm enough that only I could hear it over the music. That you would not walk up and kiss someone like me, he said quietly, unless you already belonged in my world. For a moment, I just stared at him, trying to understand exactly what he meant. The music continued around us, a low, steady rhythm under the laughter and conversations filling the crowded bar, but Adrian's words had shifted something in my mind. Belonged in your world, I repeated slowly. I think you are giving that kiss way too much importance. Adrian did not look offended. If anything, the calm expression on his face suggested he had expected that answer. Perhaps, he said. But people tend to create stories very quickly when they see something unusual. I followed his gaze across the room again. A few people were still looking in our direction, though they tried to hide it whenever our eyes moved their way. One man quickly pretended to watch the television above the bar. A woman near the dance floor leaned closer to her friend and whispered something while glancing toward us. It was subtle, but noticeable now that I was paying attention. You are saying they think I know you, I said. Adrian nodded once. Something like that. I let out a quiet laugh, and shook my head. That is ridiculous. I walked in here 20 minutes ago because my parking meter was about to expire, and this place had the shortest line. Adrian rested one hand lightly against the counter, listening with quiet patience. Unfortunately, he said, most people do not know that part of the story. I sighed softly and ran a hand through my hair. Great. So now half the bar thinks I am. What exactly? Adrian tilted his head slightly, as if considering the best way to phrase it. Someone who is comfortable approaching me, he said finally, which suggests familiarity. And familiarity suggests. I prompted. Connection. The word landed heavier than I expected. I picked up my drink again and took another sip while thinking about that. The ice had melted slightly, making the lime flavor softer and easier to drink. You know, I said after a moment, when my friends dared me to do this, I thought the worst thing that could happen was embarrassment. Adrian watched me with quiet interest. And now, I glanced across the bar again where my friends were still sitting at the table. Jenna looked like she was trying very hard not to stare directly at us. Tyler kept checking his phone like someone waiting for an update about a situation he did not fully control. Now I feel like I accidentally started a rumor I do not understand, I said. Adrian gave a small nod. That is a fair description. I leaned against the bar again, lowering my voice slightly. So let me get this straight. Because I kissed you, people think I know you. And because people think I know you, they assume I belong in your world. Adrian's expression remained calm, but there was a faint spark of amusement in his eyes. Yes. And what exactly is your world? I asked. For a brief moment, he did not answer. His gaze moved toward the entrance again, where the two men in suits had quietly taken seats earlier. One of them stood up now and walked toward the bar, speaking briefly with the bartender before leaving a folded piece of paper beside Adrian's empty glass. Adrian glanced at the note, read it quickly, then set it aside without any visible reaction. Only after the man walked away did Adrian look back at me. It is a world where people pay attention to who stands next to whom, he said calmly. I considered that for a second, then laughed quietly. That sounds exhausting. This time Adrian's smile was a little clearer. It can be. I set my glass down again and crossed my arms thoughtfully. Well, for the record, I am definitely not part of that world. Adrian did not argue. Instead, he studied my face for a moment longer, as if weighing something silently. Then he said something that made the night feel even stranger. You may not be, he said. But after tonight, people will still remember that you stood here anyway. For a moment, neither of us spoke. The note that had been placed beside Adrian's glass remained untouched, the folded paper resting quietly on the polished wood like something waiting for the right moment. Around us, the bar continued its steady rhythm. Someone dropped a handful of quarters into the jukebox, and the music shifted again, louder this time. A couple near the pool table cheered when someone made a difficult shot. Laughter rose and faded like waves against the walls. But the longer I stood next to Adrian, the more I noticed how the atmosphere around him never fully blended into the chaos. It was as if an invisible line existed around his space. Not large, maybe 6 or 7 feet, in every direction. Close enough that people still filled the bar, but far enough that no one casually leaned against the counter beside him. I glanced at the folded note again. Are you going to read that? I asked. Adrian followed my gaze, then gently slid the paper closer with 2 fingers. Later, he said calmly. It is not urgent. That answer somehow made me even more curious. You did not even look surprised when he gave it to you, I said. Should I have been, he asked. Most people would at least ask what it is. About. Adrian rested his hand on the counter again, his posture relaxed. In my experience, he said quietly, notes delivered in bars rarely contain anything cheerful. I blinked. That is oddly specific. His faint smile returned for half a second. It is also accurate. I leaned back against the bar again, letting my eyes move across the room. My friends were still watching from the table, though they tried to pretend they were deep in conversation. Jenna lifted her glass toward me like she was asking silently if everything was okay. I gave a small shrug in response. You know, I said after a moment, if someone had told me when I walked in tonight that a random dare would turn into this kind of conversation, I probably would have stayed home and watched a movie. Adrian looked at me with mild curiosity. What kind of movie? The question caught me off guard. Something simple, I said. Something where the biggest problem is whether the main character forgets to send a text message. Adrian considered that. That does sound peaceful. Your life does not look very peaceful, I replied. He glanced around the room slowly again, observing the same quiet details he had been watching all evening. The security guard at the door, the bartender restocking glasses, the two men in suits near the wall who seemed to check the time every few minutes. Peaceful is relative, he said finally. I tilted my head. Meaning? Adrian met my eyes again, calm and thoughtful as always. Meaning that what feels normal to one person can look very complicated to someone else. I thought about that for a moment, then nodded slightly. That is fair. For a few seconds the conversation paused again while the bartender passed behind us carrying a crate of fresh glasses. I noticed he gave Adrian a quick respectful nod before disappearing toward the other end of the counter. You see that? I said quietly. Adrian followed my glance. See what? Everyone keeps doing that, I said, looking at you like they are checking in. Adrian did not deny it. They are. Why? I asked. Because this place runs smoothly when people pay attention. I laughed softly. That still sounds like you are describing a small country instead of a bar. Adrian did not laugh, but his expression warmed slightly. Sometimes the difference is smaller than people think. I picked up my drink again and finished the last sip, the ice clinking quietly at the bottom of the glass. Well, I said, setting the empty glass down. For someone who accidentally walked into your world tonight, I have to admit it is a lot more mysterious than I expected. Adrian studied me for a moment longer, then nodded slowly. Most people discover that eventually, he said. And for the first time since the conversation began, his tone carried the faintest hint that the night was only just beginning. The faint hint in Adrian's voice lingered in my mind longer than I expected. It was subtle, but unmistakable, like he knew something about the direction of the night that I did not. I rested my elbows lightly on the bar and looked around again, trying to see the room the way he seemed to see it. The music had picked up again, the beat faster now, and a small group of people had moved closer to the dance floor. The bartender polished a row of glasses with careful precision while keeping one eye on the crowd. The security guard near the entrance spoke briefly into a small radio clipped to his shoulder. Everything looked ordinary at first glance. But once you noticed the patterns, it became harder to ignore them. People moved differently near Adrian. Conversations lowered slightly when they passed his end of the counter. Even the servers seemed to adjust their path, so they never crossed directly between him and the entrance. I glanced back at him. You were serious earlier, I said, when you said people pay attention to who stands next to whom. Adrian nodded slowly. They do. So if I stand here long enough, I said lightly, am I going to become part of some complicated social map of this bar? Adrian gave a quiet breath that almost sounded like a laugh. Something like that. I tapped the empty glass in front of me with one finger. That seems like a lot of responsibility for someone who just wanted a drink after work. Adrian studied my face again, that thoughtful look returning. What do you do after work, Sophie? He asked. The question felt strangely normal compared to everything else we had talked about. I work at a marketing firm downtown, I said. Most of my day involves explaining social media trends to people who pretend they understand them. Adrian listened carefully. And tonight? Tonight my friends convinced me to celebrate the fact that it is Friday. A reasonable tradition, he said. I smiled faintly, until someone suggested a dare. Adrian glanced briefly at the table where my friends were sitting. Tyler immediately looked away again the moment Adrian's gaze drifted in that direction. They seem concerned, Adrian observed. They are, I said. They think I accidentally walked into something complicated. Adrian considered that for a moment. Did you? I opened my mouth to answer, but paused. Because the truth was, I was no longer completely sure. The night had started with something simple. Music, friends, a crowded bar. But now there were notes appearing beside Adrian's glass, quiet signals exchanged between people in suits, and an invisible awareness in the room that seemed to revolve around him. Maybe a little, I admitted finally. Adrian's expression remained calm, but there was something thoughtful behind it now. Almost like curiosity had shifted direction. And yet you are still standing here. I shrugged lightly. Curiosity can be stronger than caution sometimes. Adrian nodded slowly, as if that answer confirmed something he had been considering. Just then the bartender approached again, setting a fresh glass of water in front of Adrian without being asked. He gave a quick respectful nod before stepping away. Adrian barely acknowledged the gesture, his attention still on me. Curiosity can lead to interesting places, he said quietly. Or strange ones, I added. Adrian lifted the water glass and took a small sip before answering. Often both. I folded my arms again, leaning slightly closer to the bar as the music shifted once more. The room seemed a little louder now, the night reaching that point where conversations became more animated and laughter echoed more freely. But the strange gravity around Adrian remained exactly the same. You know what I am starting to realize? I said. Adrian raised one eyebrow slightly. What is that? I looked directly at him, the realization forming slowly as I spoke. I think the most interesting thing about tonight is not the dare. Adrian waited patiently. It is the fact that everyone else in this room seems to know something about you that I still do not. For the first time since we started talking, Adrian did not answer immediately. He looked around the bar once more, taking in the quiet patterns of movement and attention that had been there all along. Then his eyes returned to mine, calm but thoughtful. That is because, he said slowly, people tend to learn about my world in pieces. Adrian's words lingered in the air between us, calm and measured, like everything else about him. People tend to learn about my world in pieces. I considered that quietly while the bar continued to pulse with energy around us. The song playing over the speakers shifted again, something louder this time, and a group near the dance floor erupted into cheers as someone attempted a dramatic spin that nearly knocked over a chair. The noise of the room rose and fell like waves, but the space beside Adrian still felt oddly steady. Pieces, I repeated thoughtfully. That sounds like a very careful way of saying people usually find out slowly. Adrian rested one hand lightly against the bar, his posture relaxed but attentive. It is often easier that way. I watched him for a moment, studying the calm certainty in his expression. Easier for who? I asked. Adrian did not answer immediately. His gaze drifted briefly toward the entrance again, where the security guard had just stepped aside to allow a couple inside. The guard spoke quietly to someone on his radio before returning to his usual watchful position. Adrian seemed to notice every detail without appearing to focus on any of them. For everyone involved, he said finally. I folded my arms loosely against the counter and tilted my head. You know, the more you explain things, the more mysterious it sounds. A faint smile appeared again, subtle but genuine. That is not intentional. It feels intentional, I said. Adrian lifted his glass of water again and took a slow sip before setting it down. You asked a question earlier, he said, about what people assume when they see you standing here. I nodded. Yes. The answer is simple, he continued calmly. They assume you are not afraid of me. I blinked, caught slightly off guard by the directness of that statement. Should I be? Adrian watched me carefully, as if weighing how much honesty the moment deserved. Most people prefer to keep their distance. I glanced across the room again, remembering the quiet space around his seat, the careful glances, the subtle shifts in behavior. Because of your reputation? I asked. Adrian gave a small nod. Something like that. I leaned back slightly and exhaled a quiet laugh. Well, that explains a lot. Adrian raised an eyebrow. It does. Yes, I said. My friends look like they are watching someone walk across a frozen lake. Adrian looked briefly toward their table again. Tyler immediately pretended to study the television mounted above the bar. Jenna lifted her drink and took a very long sip while avoiding eye contact entirely. Adrian turned back to me. They are concerned about you. They are dramatic, I corrected gently. Adrian considered that, but did not argue. The folded note beside his empty whiskey glass caught my attention again. It had not moved since it was placed there earlier. You still have not read that, I said. Adrian followed my gaze and finally picked up the small folded paper between his fingers. He unfolded it slowly and scanned the message inside. His expression did not change much, but something in his posture shifted slightly. Not tension exactly, more like quiet confirmation. He folded the note again and slid it back onto the bar. Everything okay? I asked. Adrian nodded once. Yes. I studied his face for another moment, trying to read something behind the calm expression, but whatever reaction he had was already carefully hidden again. You are very good at that, I said. Adrian looked at me with mild curiosity. At what? Not reacting, I said. Adrian considered that observation thoughtfully. Reaction is rarely useful in public. I laughed softly. That sounds like advice from someone who has learned it the hard way. Adrian did not confirm or deny it. Instead, he glanced around the bar one more time before returning his attention to me. "Let me ask you something, Sophie," he said calmly. "If you had known who I was before your friends dared you to kiss me, would you still have done it?" The question hung in the air, heavier than anything we had discussed so far. I thought about it for a second, then smiled faintly. "Probably not," I admitted. Adrian nodded slowly, as if that answer made perfect sense. Then he said something that made the entire night feel suddenly more significant. "That is exactly why it happened." For a moment, I just looked at him, trying to decide whether that statement was philosophical or simply confusing on purpose. The music continued to fill the bar, a steady beat rolling through the room while laughter and conversation blended into a familiar Friday night chaos. But Adrian's last words lingered in my mind longer than the sound of the music. "That is exactly why it happened." I leaned slightly against the bar and studied him more carefully. "You say things like that," I said slowly, "like this was somehow inevitable." Adrian did not look offended by the observation. If anything, he seemed thoughtful. "Not inevitable," he replied calmly. "Just unlikely." I raised an eyebrow. "That is not much clearer." He glanced around the room again, his eyes moving over the crowd with the quiet awareness I had already begun to notice about him. Two men near the entrance were speaking quietly with the security guard. A server hurried past carrying a tray of drinks balanced perfectly between her hands. Someone laughed loudly near the jukebox as the next song began to play. Adrian returned his attention to me. "Most people who know who I am," he said, "approach carefully. They choose their words. They measure their distance." I nodded slowly. "And I did none of those things." "Exactly." I laughed softly. "That was because I had no idea who you were." Adrian gave a small nod. "Which made your decision honest." The word caught my attention. "Honest?" "Yes," he said. "You were not trying to impress anyone. You were not trying to gain anything. You were simply responding to a moment." I thought about that while turning the empty glass slowly on the bar in front of me. You were giving a lot of meaning to what was basically a tequila-fueled mistake. Adrian's faint smile returned. "Sometimes those are the most interesting moments." I glanced again toward my friends. Jenna and Tyler were still watching carefully from their table, though they quickly looked away the moment I caught them staring. "They think I have made a terrible social error," I said. Adrian followed my gaze briefly. "They believe you stepped into unfamiliar territory." "Did I?" I asked. Adrian considered the question for a second before answering. "You stepped into a conversation that most people avoid." "Why avoid it?" I asked. Adrian rested his hand on the counter again, his voice steady and calm. "Because conversations lead to connections, and connections lead to attention." I frowned slightly. "You keep talking about attention, like it is a dangerous thing." Adrian did not answer immediately. Instead, he looked around the bar again, observing the same quiet patterns of movement that I was only beginning to notice. A man at a nearby table checked his phone and glanced toward Adrian before quickly looking away. The bartender adjusted a row of glasses and gave Adrian a respectful nod. Adrian turned back to me. "Attention can change how people treat you," he said quietly, "even when you did nothing to earn it." I considered that for a moment, then shrugged lightly. "Well, if people think I know you, they are going to be disappointed." Adrian tilted his head slightly. "Why?" "Because this entire conversation started with a dare and a bad decision," I said. Adrian's expression softened with quiet amusement again. "You may see it that way," he said, "but other people rarely know the full story." I folded my arms and leaned closer to the bar again. "Then maybe they should ask before inventing their own version." Adrian studied me with that same thoughtful look. "They usually do not ask," he said. "They simply watch." The word hung in the air for a moment. I followed his gaze across the bar again, noticing how several people glanced our way before quickly pretending they had not. The strange awareness in the room suddenly felt a little clearer. I turned back toward Adrian slowly. "So now they are watching me." Adrian nodded once. "Yes." I exhaled quietly and shook my head with a small laugh. "All because of one stupid dare." Adrian's calm expression did not change, but there was a hint of certainty in his voice when he spoke again. "Sometimes," he said, "one small moment is enough to change how a room sees you." The idea lingered in my mind longer than I expected. One small moment is enough to change how a room sees you. I looked around the bar again, this time more aware of the subtle glances Adrian had mentioned. They were not obvious stares. Most people were careful about that. But every few seconds someone's eyes drifted in our direction before quickly shifting away. It felt like standing under a quiet spotlight I had not agreed to step into. I exhaled slowly and ran a hand through my hair. You know what the strange part is? I said. Adrian watched me calmly. What is that? Nothing about tonight felt important when it started, I said. It was just another Friday. My friends complaining about work. Someone suggesting a dumb dare. The kind of thing people forget by Monday. Adrian listened without interrupting, his expression thoughtful. But now, he asked gently. I shrugged lightly. Now it feels like I accidentally stepped into the middle of a story I did not know existed. Adrian's faint smile returned, though there was something more reflective behind it this time. That is often how people discover my world, he said quietly. I studied him again, trying to understand the calm certainty he carried. For someone who had apparently built a reputation strong enough to shift the behavior of an entire room, Adrian spoke with surprising patience. There was no arrogance in his voice. No need to prove anything. Just quiet awareness. I glanced toward the entrance again. The security guard had stepped outside briefly, letting a cool gust of night air roll into the bar before the door closed again. Somewhere near the jukebox, a group of people began arguing about which song should play next. The ordinary rhythm of the night continued. Yet the invisible attention Adrian had mentioned still hovered around us. Does it ever get tiring? I asked suddenly. Adrian tilted his head slightly. What does? Being watched, I said. Having everyone analyze every conversation you have. Adrian considered that for a moment before answering. You become accustomed to it. That sounds like a polite way of saying yes. Adrian's faint smile appeared again. Perhaps. I leaned back against the counter again and folded my arms. You know what the funniest part is? I said. What is that? Adrian asked. Half an hour ago my biggest concern was whether my parking meter outside would expire. Adrian glanced toward the front windows as if briefly picturing the street outside. Did it? He asked calmly. I laughed softly. Almost definitely. Adrian nodded thoughtfully, like that detail was just as relevant as everything else we had discussed. For a few seconds neither of us spoke again while the noise of the bar flowed around us. Then Adrian rested his hand lightly on the bar and looked at me with the same steady attention he had shown all evening. Sophie, he said quietly. Yes. There is something you should understand. I raised an eyebrow slightly. That sounds serious. Adrian did not smile this time. It is simply honest. I waited. Adrian's voice remained calm, but the weight of his words felt different now. After tonight, people will remember that you stood here beside me. I nodded slowly. You mentioned that earlier. Adrian held my gaze for another moment. What I did not mention, he continued, is that some people may become curious about why. The thought settled in my mind immediately. Curiosity from strangers in a crowded bar was one thing. Curiosity from the kind of world Adrian seemed to live in sounded different. I considered that for a moment, then sighed softly. So the rumor continues. Adrian nodded once. Rumors are simply stories that travel faster than explanations. I let out a quiet laugh. That is probably the most accurate sentence I have heard all night. Adrian studied my face again, thoughtful as always. Then he said something that made the entire situation feel both strange and oddly reassuring at the same time. Fortunately, he said calmly, not every story that begins with confusion ends badly. For a few seconds, I let Adrian's last words settle in the quiet space between us. Not every story that begins with confusion ends badly. The music continued to move through the bar, steady and bright, and the energy of the crowd had reached that late-night rhythm where laughter became louder and conversations blended together into a warm, chaotic hum. But standing there beside Adrian, the noise felt distant somehow, like we were having a separate conversation inside the same room. I leaned lightly against the counter and looked around once more. The same subtle glances were still happening. People noticing. People wondering. A story quietly forming in their minds. I let out a small breath and shook my head with a faint smile. You know, I said, if someone tells this story tomorrow, it is going to sound much more dramatic than it actually was. Adrian watched me calmly. Most stories do. They will say some mysterious woman walked into your bar and kissed you like she had known you for years. I continued. They will probably imagine secret meetings and complicated plans. Adrian's faint smile returned. People enjoy mystery. The real version is much less impressive, I said. The real version involves a parking meter, a margarita, and friends who think dares are funny. Adrian nodded thoughtfully. Sometimes, the simplest version of a story is the one people refuse to believe. I laughed quietly at that. That is probably true. For a moment we both looked across the room again. My friends were still at the table, though they had relaxed slightly now that the conversation had clearly not turned into the disaster they had feared. Jenna waved cautiously when she noticed me looking. Tyler lifted his glass in a silent question that seemed to ask whether everything was still normal. I gave them a small reassuring nod before turning back toward Adrian. I should probably go rescue them from their imagination, I said. Adrian tilted his head slightly. They appear to be doing fine. They are pretending not to stare, I said. Adrian's faint smile returned again. They are not very good at it. I laughed softly and pushed away from the bar slightly, preparing to step back toward my friends. But before I moved, Adrian spoke again. Sophie. I paused and looked back at him. Yes. Adrian reached into the inside pocket of his jacket and pulled out a small card. He placed it on the counter between us and slid it gently across the polished wood. If curiosity ever wins again, he said calmly, that will help you find me. I looked down at the card. The design was simple. Just a name and a phone number printed in clean lettering. Adrian Moretti. I looked back up at him with a slightly amused expression. You realize that giving someone your number after a strange night like this only adds to the rumors. Adrian did not look concerned. Rumors exist either way. I picked up the card and turned it once between my fingers before slipping it into the pocket of my jacket. Fair point. For a moment neither of us spoke again. Then I stepped back from the bar and gave him a small nod. Well, I said lightly. Thank you for the conversation. Adrian returned the nod with the same calm composure he had shown all night. Thank you for the unexpected moment. I smiled faintly at that and turned toward my friend's table. As I walked across the bar, I could still feel the quiet curiosity following me from different corners of the room. But now it felt less intimidating and more like the beginning of a strange story I had not expected to step into. And just before I reached the table, Adrian's earlier words returned quietly in my mind. Sometimes one small moment is enough to change how a room sees you.